Previously on A Place for Healing podcast. Hey everyone, thank you for joining me on another episode this week. It's your host, Healing Coach Afisha Superville, coming to you with another healing message for this week. Now, today I want to share with you guys the empowering technique of learning how to reframe your life. What do I mean by reframing? Well, simple. Let's say, for instance, you have a picture that has already been framed. However, the frame is broken and no longer holds the picture in place. So you know what you do? You go to the store, you buy another frame, and you reframe that picture so that it holds the picture together and that it works for the picture to stay in place, as opposed to the old frame that needed to be reframed. So for me, reframing is a technique that I use on a daily basis. It is generally used in professions like coaching or therapy and stuff. However, it's something that you can use no matter who you are or what kind of collar or sleeves you wear on a day-to-day basis professionally. I found that learning how to reframe has been a technique that I've been using for a very long time. However, I want to use a specific instance as to where I've used reframing to help me to get to where I am right now, making this podcast, speaking to you guys, so that you might see the benefits that it might serve in your life and try it on for size, if it's something that you want to do. Now, I've shared in the past that making this podcast was easier said than done. Making the money to get the equipment was more on the easier side of things, whereas making the podcast, making the episodes, speaking, sharing was a little bit more challenging, and it was something that I had to figure out. In that process, I learned that I was holding on to some hurtful belief systems that I have been programmed to believe since I was a child. As I was growing up, I was always a pretty talkative person to some degree. When I was in school, I knew that I needed to just do my schoolwork and focus on that as opposed to trying to talk all the time. So the most talking that I did was with my peers during like my off periods and at home. At home, I was taught that what I had to say was too much. I was too deep. I was too talkative. I didn't know when to shut up. So they said. And when I was making the podcast and I was trying to share, I was like, ooh, no, that's not right. Ooh, oh my God, I said too much. Oops, maybe I shouldn't go that far down the road. I was having difficulty figuring out how to share because as I was sharing, I was having these thoughts of I'm not good enough to do the thing that I wanted to do. And I had to learn how to reframe how I thought about my communication style or the way in which I communicated and not what other people thought about me. Other people may have thought that I talk too much and the message that they were giving me that I should just shut up or keep my mouth closed or say little to nothing. Like that saying, girls are meant to be seen and not heard. I heard that a lot of times. And that was something that also lent a hand to me not feeling comfortable enough to even speak up. However, these thoughts weren't my own, and I didn't even actually believe it. Because if I really believed it, would I have really purchased this equipment to create a podcast? No. I actually made this podcast because I wanted a space to actually feel free to share in a way in which I was not allowed to as I was growing up, because I was taught that I talk too much, I do too much, I'm too deep, all of these things. Now I'm a Scorpio, so maybe that has a contribution to the depth in which I like to go into conversations. However, I don't think that it was fair for me to be taught that the words that I had to say was too much and not understandable or not even worth sharing in that matter. And I had to start thinking about how I thought about what I had to share. Instead of thinking, I talk too much, I do too much, I'm too deep in terms of conversation wise, I had to change the relationship that I had with those things and reframe that into saying that it's not that I talk too much. Or what that really means is that I just have a lot of information to share. And I like to share and I like to communicate. I like to talk. And there is nothing right or wrong about sharing. Sharing is something that is meant to be understood or meant to be shared as a way to learn. Like we hear our parents talk, we hear teachers talk, we hear the newscasters talk, we hear babies talk, like we use communication as a way to get our needs met. So for me to think that my words didn't matter or my words was too much and I needed to tone it down a little was not helpful for me to be an effective communicator when I was in certain situations or creating this podcast. It was challenging for me to get an episode out because I was constantly going over the fact that like, oh, this isn't right, or this isn't being done right, or maybe I should clip it, or maybe I should tone it down a little bit, or maybe I shouldn't share that much, or maybe I shouldn't do this. And that was stopping me from being my authentic self. Now, I could attest to the fact that I know I have moments in which I go too far in certain scenarios, and it might make sense to not do that in every situation that I am because it might work for some, but it might not work for all. So learning how to communicate is something that is important for everyone to learn how to do. But thinking that I just didn't know how to do it in general didn't help me to learn how to do it any better. In fact, it almost stopped me from sharing this podcast altogether. So it's not that I talk too much or I do too much or I'm too deep. I just have a lot of information to share. So I ask you, what thoughts in your life no longer serve you? And how are you going to reframe your life? Reframing is something that you get to do. It's a tool that we all get to use. So how are you going to reframe your life? I asked you that question, and I invite you guys to put in the comments below, what ways have you learned how to reframe your life? What were the things that you reframed in your life? And how do you feel about reframing your life? Remember, this is a judgment-free zone. So if there's anybody that's getting crazy in the comments, I just want to give you forewarning that we are not tolerating that type of behavior in this space, because what I'm wanting to cultivate in this environment is a place for healing. So everybody, please be respectful and be kind and be understanding. When people share, that is a strength, not a weakness. So don't take it for granted. Don't misuse it. Cherish people who are willing to share with you what is really going on for them, because most times than not, we're walking around with a mask being something that we're not. Just like me. I had to change how I communicated when I was in the house, because in the house, I was taught that the words that I had to share was too much. So I had to dumb it down a bit while I was home, and that was pretty suffocating. It made me feel very misunderstood, and that is also a part of some of the resentment that I was holding on to, because it was thoroughly unfair to be taught that what you have to say is too much. It's like calling a crazy person crazy. How does that help that person? It's like trying to de-escalate a situation, right? Let's say if somebody's yelling or whatever and they're visibly upset, but then you tell them calm down. How effective do you think that will work? To tell them to calm down. They're upset. those emotions doesn't change by the flip of a switch. It takes time. And it works best to acknowledge the person and their feelings as opposed to discouraging them altogether, because then that creates a narrative of the thoughts that live in their head and the feelings that ruminate in their being that doesn't actually help them to be a better person. So I encourage you guys to be kind to each other, and remember, you deserve all that you do, and healing is definitely one of them. I'll see you next week.